What's up, Scyushi Squad? We are back with some more Trove, and today we're going to be highlighting the Solarion. More specifically, we're going to be talking about the ins and outs of the class. We're going to be talking about its abilities. Now, I know, we've got all sorts of different smaller videos focusing on different aspects instead of just having one condensed video talking about the entirety of the class. But you got to understand that I end up getting a lot of very specific questions from you guys, and this way it's a lot easier for you guys to just search for what you want as an answer rather than having to siphon through longer videos that end up encapsulating a bunch of different things. Now, obviously, I'm still going to end up working on much longer, more in-depth guides, but today, for example, we're going to end up talking about how the abilities work with the Solarion, how you can complement your damage over time, or dot effects, as I'll refer to further in the video. And then we'll end up having separate videos talking about how you actually build the class, checking it out at 36k PR and further PR when I end up getting crystal gems and so on and so forth. That is not what today's video is about. This is strictly to show off the abilities of the class. So, of course, first and foremost, everybody's always asking what damage type is the class. It's going to be a physical class. Rule of thumb to try and figure out what damage type of class is look at the weapon. So when you end up being on the class and looking at the weapon, you'll see what damage type it is. The reason why I say that is because the Bard uses a fist weapon similar to the Vanguard, but when you're on the Bard, the fist actually does magic damage, and then when you're on the Vanguard, the fist weapon does physical damage. It's a whole can of worms that we don't want to talk about. Frankly speaking, I think Trove needs to change that whole damage system so that it's just attack, never mind physical or magic. But anyways, let's get into the passive ability first and foremost of the Solarion. So the Solarion gains Divine Radiance and energy from their damage over time effects, or the dot. Divine Radiance increases the number of projectiles fired from basic attacks. Energy is used to power their Prismatic Blast, which is your ultimate ability. So there is more to the passive, but just before we move on, I wanted to kind of dive a little bit more into that, and just to explain that what it's basically saying is when you use your other abilities, you're going to end up establishing a dot on an enemy, so a damage over time effect. And when that is damaging enemies, it's going to end up recharging your energy, which is used for your ultimate ability, but it's also going to end up recharging your, let's call them feathers, because I don't know what else to call them, which your base attack is going to end up shooting one arrow. But when you end up having a dot on an enemy, you'll end up slowly getting this to charge up over time as well. So you can shoot one arrow, 3 arrows, 4 or 5 arrows, and then finally with the complete maximum, if the world wasn't so broken. Oh, now we're just down to 1 arrow. But point is, you can end up doing a big shotgun blast, which will explain a little bit more about all the base attacks and stuff. I just wanted to let you guys know that it's from the passive and damage over time effects that's going to generate that aspect of the character, because it kind of goes hand in hand with, you're going to be doing dots so that you can establish these other abilities to end up doing more damage, and then these other abilities are going to end up complementing the dots. So the Solarion summons a Phoenix to aid them in battle. Phoenix attacks apply a damage over time effect that deals 250% damage every 0.5 seconds for a total of 5 seconds. Additionally, granting Divine Radiance and energy back to the Solarion. So this guy is also going to end up fighting and giving us some energy and stuff like that as well, and giving us more of our arrows. When Phoenix dies, it will spawn an egg at its location. The egg will heal itself and then explode once at maximum health, and it'll deal 550% damage to nearby enemies, as well as apply its damage over time effect and respawning the Phoenix. So it basically just ends up tagging the enemies with a dot and then respawning the Phoenix at the same time. Basic attack. The Solarion sends out a shot from their bow, dealing 175% damage to enemies in front of them. Any of the Solarion's damage over time effects are refreshed by tagging an enemy with your base attack. So if our Phoenix tags an enemy and then we keep pummeling it, it's going to keep refreshing that timer, which is, again, where all of your abilities kind of go hand in hand, because essentially what you're going to do with this character is you're going to tag an enemy with all of your damage over time effects, and then you're going to start pummeling it with your base attack, which is going to end up essentially keeping the damage over time effects going the whole time. So the primary ability, Solar Flare. The Solarion fires a charged explosive shot that increases the area of effect the longer it's charged. So that's going to end up being either a simple right click. It's basically the Shadowhunter's old right click ability, just reused on this character, or you can end up charging the attack, and then when you release it at the point of its explosion, it's going to end up, hitting more enemies if you ended up actually charging it. There is also going to end up being a couple effects to it, but the Solar Flare applies a damage over time effect that deals 150% damage every 0.5 seconds over the course of 5 seconds. Additionally, grants Divine Radiance and energy back to the Solarion. And the Solarion gains slow fall while the ability is active and for a short time afterwards as well. The Phoenix will also target enemies damaged by the Solar Flare. So if we actually tag this dummy right here, you'll see that we've got the slow fall effect of your boy the Gunslinger, which it doesn't seem to last very long, and ignore our damage numbers. These training dummies are broken. So then there's going to end up being the number 1 ability, which is Guiding Light. So summons a pillar of light that the targeted location that expands over time and deals 100% damage to enemies, 150% damage every 0.5 seconds for 5 seconds in the area while healing friendly targets. This is explained very, very poorly. I really hope that the devs can optimize their patch notes, because this was terrible on the test server. It's terrible here. So I'm just kind of reading it verbatim. If it sounds confusing, that's because it's written very confusing. Because even though it ended up saying that it does 150% damage every 0.5 seconds for 5 seconds, it additionally says applies a damage over time effect, dealing 250% damage every 0.5 seconds for 5 seconds. So is it applying 2 dots, or did they just end up typoing an extra dot into that description? I think that the 150% that they'd mentioned is just a typo that they copy and pasted from the primary ability, the Solar Flare. I could be wrong, but again, I'm just going to read it verbatim, man. So additionally, the number 1 ability will grant Divine Radiance, which restores energy to the Solarion. And then if there's a Phoenix egg on the ground, so if the Phoenix died and then its egg is on the ground, the Guiding Light will cause the egg to explode faster. So it basically heals it, right? This ability can be cast in rapid succession with up to 3 guiding lights being stacked at one time. So you can see down at the bottom middle, we've got 3 of them, just indicated with the tiny little number there. But you can see that's what the ability looks like. It's slowly going to spread out and deal damage to a larger area. The fact that we can end up stacking them means that you can put down 2 of them on an enemy to end up dealing more damage, or you can end up just covering the entire field by putting like a whole bunch of them all over the place if you want to end up dealing with lots of different mobs and so on and so forth. But overall, that is going to end up kind of being your bread and butter ability when you're doing dungeons, and even just to pop out really quick damage, just because of the fact that it does such an absurd amount of damage. But we're going to move on to the ultimate ability. So Prismatic Blast continually creates a blast of energy, dealing 400% damage to enemies in an area around the Solarion. Each blast costs energy and gives the Solarion a damage buff that stacks up to 5 times. This buff lasts until Prismatic Blast ends, and it toggles off if your energy is depleted. That's how the ability ends up going away. So now you kind of see the big picture here, where essentially you're going to tag enemies with all of your damage over time effects, and then you're going to end up using your ult, and then you're going to use your base attack, because while you're having all of your damage over time effects going on at the same time, they're all going to end up fueling back your energy into you, and then your base attack is going to keep refreshing the damage over time effects so that you don't have to keep reapplying them, right? So we can see on the training dummy, again, ignore the damage numbers, this little wing effect on top, that's going to end up being one of the damage over time effects. So if I tag it with a right click, If I tag it with a right click, there we go. That's going to be another dot. If I tag it with my number 1, that's another dot. And now if I keep hitting it with my main attack, it's going to keep all of those going at the same time. Right? So we just got to make sure that we keep on tagging it, but our club world is kind of broken. So yeah. Essentially, that's going to end up giving us tons and tons of energy recharge, right? So what we would do is right click number 1, use your ult, use a pot, and then you start spamming your left click, because it's going to have all of those dots going on at a time. And you can see in the bottom right that I am literally fighting with myself to try and keep my energy up while it's depleting in the middle of combat, which ends up making it do insane amounts of damage once you can end up getting all 5 stacks. But you have to be very, very aggressive with trying to have all of your dots going at the same time, because that's going to start giving you enough energy that you can last long enough to have at least 5 explosions go off, if not more than that, right? So up next, we're going to be talking about the class gem ability for the Solarion, which is going to end up being pretty mandatory. Granted, it's not going to end up being very exciting. It generally is just going to be more damage. So this is how it's going to end up working. It's going to make it so that Prismatic Blast, which is your number one or your ultimate ability, will now pulse around the Phoenix as well as the Solarion, allowing the Solarion to maintain range while attacking, because essentially if the Phoenix is up close and personal with an enemy and you end up using your ultimate ability, the Phoenix is then going to end up applying all of the damage buffs and so on and so forth that you get for using your ultimate, right? So I don't know why you would end up actually trying to keep at a distance, because frankly speaking, if you go up close and personal, you're essentially doing twice the amount of damage, because you're going to end up having the ult of your Phoenix tagging enemies and the ult of your character tagging enemies. But at the very least, you could cover a very wide area, right? So it says that you can maintain range damage and deal area of effect damage around the Phoenix. Anyways, that's going to end up being the class gem ability, which again is not super duper exciting, but it is something that is definitely a mandatory gem to get if you want to main the guy. So then let's talk about the hidden ring effects. So there's going to end up being 3 of these, but frankly speaking, only 2 of them count. So there's going to be Guiding Flight, so Prismatic Blast, which is your ultimate, and Guiding Light, which is going to end up being your number 1 ability, will now apply the Solar Wings slow fall effect. So essentially you could use your ultimate or your number 1. All of your abilities except for your base attack are going to end up giving you the slow fall that you get for right click shooting something, which is going to end up being pretty nice just for the sake of movement. But generally speaking, I don't think that there's anyone who's going to end up wanting that ability. It's pretty lackluster, doesn't end up giving you any additional damage, so why would you take it over others? Another hidden ring effect is the Solar Stance. So this removes the Solar Wings effect entirely from your right click, but it now applies a damage reduction buff for a short time instead. So when you right click something, you'll end up getting armor, right? You'll end up taking less damage, which again is nice, but generally speaking, everything one-shots you in this game anyways, and there is literally no reason to end up having any type of defense on any character, because it's all just about increasing your damage output, which is why the last ability, Prismatic Chain, is going to be the one that everyone's going to go for. Prismatic Blast, your ultimate ability, causes enemies damaged by it to also fire off an additional Prismatic Blast, which will damage nearby enemies. That's an insane one. I haven't even used the hidden ring effect, and I can already say that this class is actually pretty dang powerful, but that hidden ring effect is nuts, because if there's going to end up being a lot of enemies around, you will essentially just have them all just procking off of each other over and over. And it's crazy, because it doesn't say in the description that it's a percentage chance to succeed. It just literally says Prismatic Blast causes enemies damaged by it to also fire Prismatic Blast, which means it's a guarantee, which is a very, very big deal for any class in the game, let alone the Solarion. So last but not least, there is going to end up being the subclass ability of the Solarion, which we could end up talking about in a whole other video, frankly speaking. But I did want to end up briefly mentioning it. We'll talk about what the subclass ability does when you're at 0 to 5,000 PR, and then when you're at 40k PR, just because I don't really feel like explaining every single interval in between, because it's just a bunch of numbers and it's going to be pretty superfluous. However, the subclass ability of the Solarion is going to end up actually being really, really good. And frankly speaking, I would say is probably going to end up being the new best subclass ability on the Shadowhunter. I'm still experimenting because subclass abilities kind of got buffs across the board with this update, but this is what it's going to end up doing at 0 to 5,000 power rank on your Solarion. So if you end up having your Solarion at 0 to 5k PR, you are essentially going to end up having the following effects if you subclass his ability on a class. Basic attacks have a 25% chance to cause an explosion, dealing 100% damage that also applies a damage over time effect on enemies, which will deal 50% damage every 0.25 seconds for 5 seconds. Damage done by this effect restores energy to the user. Pretty decent effect. 25% chance is not bad with the Shadowhunter. It's also not bad with classes like the Draco or Tomb Raiser. Any type of class that has a constant barrage of attacks ends up making these effects stack quite well. Now, let's skip all the way to the end and go to what it's going to end up being at its fully maximum power. So in order to end up having the numbers that I'm going to be telling you guys, You have to have your Solarion at 40,000 power rank in order to end up accomplishing this. Obviously, you know, everything's going to slowly scale in between all of this, but at the absolute maximum, base attacks have a 40% chance to cause an explosion, which will deal 350% damage and apply the damage over time effect. The damage over time effect deals 100% damage every 0.25 seconds for 5 seconds. And then, of course, you end up recharging your energy. Now, again, I don't know if this is necessarily the best per se on the Shadowhunter. I have definitely been experimenting with it, and I do enjoy the ability. It's really, really nice. However, the fact is that it is damage over time. And frankly speaking, there's not really that many enemies that you'll end up benefiting from having a slow time to kill, except for maybe something like in U11. But frankly speaking, I would rather just end up having the burst damage of something like a Phase Subclass ability, but we'll have another video that'll highlight all of that stuff. This was just to specifically talk about the Solarion and all of its, you know, all of its goodness. Anyways, thanks for watching. Smash like, sub for more, buy the merch you want, support the channel, and have a wonderful day, everybody.